I stood silently by the kitchen counter of our Charleston estate, my hands still smelling of harsh cleaning chemicals, while my family celebrated my birthday with loud cheers in the ballroom. My name is Alana, a 26-year-old book restorer who had been ordered by my mother to clear out the dusty archives in the library instead of joining my own party. While digging through a pile of moth-eaten ledgers, my mother marched in and threw a crumpled lottery ticket at my chest, claiming she found it in the trash and that it suited a charity case, like me, perfectly. Before I could even respond, my younger sister Sasha arrived with her fiancé, Preston, flaunting their first-class tickets to Paris while discussing their grand plan to restructure this very estate. Preston leaned against the mahogany doorframe, his cold eyes scanning me with a calculated gaze that suggested I was merely a small obstacle to be removed from his land acquisition scheme. I felt a chill sharper than the evening breeze as they laughed about my future displacement, yet I calmly tucked that lottery ticket and the tattered land registry into my apron pocket. The sheer arrogance in their voices confirmed they had no idea that the trash they just handed me might contain the very key to their downfall. What life-altering secrets are hidden within that old ledger and the discarded lottery ticket, and how will Alana's destiny shift? Subscribe now to witness the beginning of a high-stakes game of justice. Late at night, when the party music had finally faded into a heavy silence, I retreated to the small restoration room tucked away at the back of the garden. The air inside smelled of old parchment and beeswax, providing a familiar sanctuary where I could finally breathe without the suffocating weight of my family's judgment. My hands trembled slightly as I reached into my apron pocket to retrieve the crumpled lottery ticket that Mom had thrown at me earlier like a piece of worthless trash. I pulled up the official lottery website on my phone with a flickering hope that felt almost dangerous in the quiet of the room. As the winning numbers appeared on the glowing screen, my breath caught in my throat because every single digit matched the paper in my hand. The realization hit me like a physical blow that I was now holding $60 million, yet a sudden wave of cold dread washed over my initial excitement. A small red banner at the bottom of the webpage warned that all prizes from this draw had to be claimed within 48 hours, or they would be forfeited forever. The ticking clock in my head started immediately, knowing that I had less than 2 days to secure this fortune before it vanished into thin air. I forced myself to tuck the ticket into a hidden compartment of my heavy oak desk because showing any sign of wealth right now would only turn my family into a pack of starving wolves. To calm my racing heart, I turned my attention back to the tattered land registry ledger that Dad had asked me to restore earlier that evening. As I carefully separated the brittle yellowed pages with my professional tools, a folded document slipped out from behind the heavy leather binding. It was a private loan agreement signed by Dad with an astronomical interest rate that seemed designed specifically to ensure he could never pay it back. The lender was listed as a shell corporation with a vague name, but I recognized the signature of the legal witness as one of Preston's closest business associates. The pieces of the puzzle began to click together with a terrifying logic as I analyzed the brutal terms of the agreement. This wasn't just a simple loan to help the family business. It was a carefully laid trap intended to trigger a foreclosure on our Charleston estate within a few weeks. Preston had clearly used Dad's desperation and lack of financial literacy to maneuver the entire family into a corner where we would lose everything to his company. I felt a surge of cold fury, realizing that while Sasha was dreaming of a lavish life in Paris, her future husband was already measuring our hallways for his own profit. My mind raced through the impossible situation of standing between two different types of ruin. If I revealed my $60 million now, Mom and Sasha would undoubtedly find a way to seize it while still leaving Dad in debt. However, if I remained silent and did nothing to intervene, this beautiful house that had been in our family for generations would be stolen by Preston's greed. I grabbed a notebook and began meticulously documenting every legal loophole and predatory clause I could find in that fraudulent contract. My training in restoration gave me a sharp eye for detail, allowing me to spot inconsistencies in the dates and signatures that a regular person might easily overlook. I spent the next hour cross-referencing the shell company's registration with public records until I found a direct link back to Preston's private holdings. This was the leverage I needed, but I had to move with extreme caution to avoid alerting him before I could claim my prize. The silence of the night was suddenly shattered by the sharp click of high heels marching toward my workspace. Sasha pushed the door open without knocking, her face still flushed from the evening's champagne, and her eyes filled with an arrogant disdain. She tossed a pile of silk dresses onto my workbench, nearly knocking over my jar of specialized adhesive in her careless haste. She demanded that I have all her outfits cleaned and packed before sunrise, because she couldn't possibly be expected to handle such menial tasks while preparing for her wedding. I remained seated, keeping my hands over the registry documents to hide the evidence of Preston's betrayal from her oblivious eyes. Sasha mocked the dusty environment of my shop once more, calling my profession a dead end for people who lacked the ambition to succeed in the real world. She walked out with a sharp laugh, completely unaware that the sister she was insulting was currently the only person standing between her and total homelessness. I waited until her footsteps died away before returning to my notes, knowing that my 48-hour countdown had officially begun. 4 days after that bitter birthday party, I caught Preston leading a group of strangers around our garden estate, as if he had already become the rightful owner of the land. They were pointing at the ancient oak trees and measuring the distance between the main house and my restoration shop with an arrogance that made my blood run cold. I kept my distance while staying hidden behind the thick ivy of the veranda, straining my ears to catch every word of their calculated conversation. Preston was laughing loudly, telling the men that the property would soon be cleared of its old clutter to make room for a modern luxury development. When the strangers finally left, Preston marched toward Dad's private study with a thick leather folder tucked firmly under his arm. I followed them, silently slipping into the shadows of the hallway, just as the heavy oak door swung shut behind them. Through the narrow crack in the doorframe, I watched Preston spread several legal documents across the mahogany desk, while Dad sat there looking exhausted and frail. Preston leaned in close, his voice dropping to a smooth, manipulative tone that sounded more like a threat than a friendly suggestion. He explained that the original loan needed an immediate update to satisfy the creditors, pushing a new addendum toward Dad's trembling hand. This new document contained a lethal clause that allowed Preston's company to seize full ownership of the entire estate if a single payment was delayed by only 7 days. Dad hesitated, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with a look of deep confusion, while his pen hovered uncertainly over the signature line. Sasha suddenly burst into the room, her face glowing with a selfish excitement that completely blinded her to the danger our father was facing. She draped her arms around Preston's shoulders, nagging Dad to sign the papers quickly so they could finally receive the wedding allowance they needed for their Paris shopping trip. Sasha complained about how embarrassing it was to keep her high society friends waiting while Dad fussed over a few pages of boring paperwork. She told Dad that he was being stubborn and old-fashioned, insisting that Preston was only trying to save the family from financial ruin. Under the combined pressure of his favorite daughter's whining and Preston's relentless persuasion, Dad's resistance began to crumble. "Russell, you just need to sign right here, and all your debt troubles will vanish in a single night," Preston whispered while tapping the paper with a gold-plated pen. I couldn't stay silent any longer and stepped into the room, my heart hammering against my ribs as I looked directly at my father's tired face. "Dad, the things that vanish the fastest usually take our most precious possessions along with them," I said firmly, hoping my voice would be enough to make him pause. Preston's expression twisted into a mask of pure rage for a split second before he regained his composure and laughed at my sudden interference. Sasha immediately began screaming at me, calling me a pathetic meddler who understood nothing about the high-stakes world of business. She told me to get back to my dusty books and stop acting like I had any right to speak in a room full of successful people. Despite my warning, Dad let out a long sigh and pressed his pen to the paper, completing the signature that essentially handed our history over to a predator. I turned and walked out, before they could say another word, retreating to the privacy of my shop to take out my phone. I had already taken clear photos of the addendum while Preston was distracted by Sasha's arrival, capturing every predatory detail for legal review. I immediately dialed the number for Julian Vance, a sharp and trusted attorney who specialized in complex estate fraud. I sent the images to his private server and waited in agonizing silence until my phone finally buzzed with his incoming call. Julian's voice was grim as he confirmed my worst fears, stating that the addendum was a blatant trap designed for an immediate hostile takeover. Alana, Preston is playing his hand openly now, and he clearly intends to throw your entire family onto the street by the end of this month. Julian warned with a professional coldness that made the situation feel even more real. He told me that we had very little time to act, especially since Dad had legally granted Preston the power to bypass standard foreclosure procedures. Sasha's voice echoed from the hallway, hurling one last insult about my snooping before she headed upstairs to pack for her trip. I ignored her, staring at the digital clock on my wall as I realized that the battle for my home had moved from the shadows into open warfare. 6 days after those chaotic events, I arranged to meet my best friend Skylar at a small cafe tucked away behind ancient oak trees on the outskirts of Charleston. I chose this quiet location specifically because the heavy branches provided a sense of privacy that had become impossible to find within the walls of my own home. My heart was still racing from the adrenaline of the past week as I sat across from Skylar and placed my phone face down on the wooden table. After a few minutes of checking our surroundings, I leaned in close to reveal that I had secretly claimed $60 million from the lottery ticket my mother had discarded. Skylar stared at me in stunned silence for a long moment before regaining her composure and asking me what I planned to do next with such an overwhelming fortune. I explained that before making any moves, I needed her to use her underground connections to dig into the actual background of Sasha's fiancé. Skylar nodded seriously and opened her laptop to access a private database she had cultivated through her work in private investigations. While she worked, I watched the steam rise from my untouched coffee and thought about the predatory documents Preston had forced Dad to sign. Within half an hour, Skylar's expression shifted from professional curiosity to a grim look of deep concern as she turned the screen toward me. She had discovered that Preston was drowning in massive gambling debts at several high-stakes casinos across the state and was currently being hunted by aggressive creditors. It became sickeningly clear that he was using our family estate as a desperate shield to cover his own financial failures before his world collapsed. I realized in that moment that Preston was far more dangerous than a simple gold digger, because a man with nothing to lose would be capable of anything. Alana, this lottery ticket is a powerful weapon, but if you reveal it too early, it will become a death sentence for you in the face of their collective greed. Skylar warned while grabbing my hand to emphasize her point. She reminded me that Mom and Sasha were already blinded by Preston's lies and would likely side with him just to get their hands on my winnings. Skylar encouraged me to keep my emotions under tight control so I could continue playing the role of the humble, struggling daughter in that house. I took a deep breath and promised her that I would remain invisible until every piece of my counter strategy was firmly in place. We spent the rest of the afternoon outlining a plan that involved legal protection and financial traps to catch Preston in his own net of deceit. When I finally returned to the estate later that evening, the heavy atmosphere of the house felt even more suffocating than when I had left. Mom was standing in the middle of the foyer holding several half-restored books from my workshop with an expression of pure annoyance on her face. She immediately began scolding me for neglecting the restoration of the antique collection she intended to sell for her upcoming vacation expenses. I tried to explain that the delicate process required patience and focus, but she cut me off with a wave of her hand that dismissed my entire existence. Mom claimed that my slow pace was holding the family back from the luxury they deserved, while Sasha was out securing a wealthy future for everyone. I truly regret allowing you to stay here for so long because at least Sasha is bringing us a future, while you only bring us piles of dust. Mom snapped before tossing the books back onto a nearby table. I stood there silently, letting her words wash over me without offering a single word of defense or anger, as I had promised Skylar. I simply picked up the damaged books and headed toward my shop, feeling the weight of the secret fortune in my pocket acting as a silent anchor. The irony of the situation was almost unbearable because the daughter they considered a failure was the only one with the power to save them from the predator they had invited into their beds. I locked the door of my workshop and began my work knowing that the dust my mother hated would soon be the only thing left of her arrogant illusions. 10 days after my clandestine meeting with Skylar, I was no longer a helpless victim standing on the sidelines, watching my family collapse into ruin. I had spent the intervening nights working closely with Julian to execute a series of complex financial maneuvers that would shift the balance of power in our favor. Using a portion of my lottery winnings through an anonymous offshore trust, I successfully purchased Dad's primary debt from the local bank before Preston's company could finalize their takeover. This strategic move effectively made me the highest-ranking creditor with the legal right to block any secondary attempts at foreclosing on the Charleston estate. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction, knowing that while Preston thought he was closing in on his prize, he was actually walking into a legal fortress I had built around our home. During my daily observations, I noticed that Preston was beginning to show signs of intense frustration as his usual intimidation tactics failed to produce the expected results. He spent hours on the phone in the garden, his voice rising in anger as he demanded to know why a mysterious third party was suddenly blocking his credit transactions. To keep him distracted and fuel his inherent greed, I coordinated with Skylar to leak a false rumor through the local business gazette. We planted information about a major international conglomerate that was allegedly interested in purchasing our garden estate for 3 times its current market value for a luxury resort project. Preston's eyes lit up with a predatory hunger the moment he heard the news, exactly as I had predicted when we designed the trap. He immediately stopped pushing for a quick sale and began focusing on how he could squeeze even more profit from the property before the supposed deal closed. The domestic pressure within the house continued to escalate as Sasha began demanding that I vacate my restoration room immediately so Preston could transform it into his private office. She marched into my workspace with a set of modern interior design magazines, claiming that my dusty hobby was an embarrassment to the professional image Preston needed to maintain. Mom supported her, completely insisting that my presence in the back of the house was an eyesore that might decrease the property value during their upcoming negotiations. I chose to remain calm and agreed to their demands without a single word of protest, which seemed to catch Sasha off guard for a moment. I used the excuse of moving my equipment to gain unfettered access to the main house's shared computer network during the late-night hours. This gave me the perfect opportunity to install a silent monitoring program that began capturing every encrypted message Preston was sending to his associates overseas. Sasha, tell your older sister not to try acting smart, because poor people usually end up destroyed when they interfere in the games of the wealthy. Preston sneered while watching me pack my tools into cardboard boxes. He was standing in the doorway with a glass of expensive bourbon, looking down at me with the same arrogance that had once made me feel small and insignificant. I paused for a second, looking him straight in the eyes with a level of confidence that clearly unsettled his smug composure. You are absolutely right about one thing, Preston. I truly hope you are wealthy enough to pay the full price for everything you are about to cause. I replied in a voice that remained cold and steady. He dismissed my words with a cynical laugh, unaware that the evidence of him secretly siphoning family funds into offshore accounts was currently being uploaded to Julian's secure server. As I moved the last of my restoration supplies into a small corner of the garage, I felt a strange sense of liberation from the emotional chains of my family's expectations. Every insult from Mom and every selfish demand from Sasha only served to strengthen my resolve to see this plan through to its ultimate conclusion. I had successfully positioned myself as the invisible architect of Preston's downfall, while everyone else in the house was busy celebrating a future that didn't exist. My focus was now entirely on the final collection of data that would prove his fraudulent intent beyond any reasonable doubt in a court of law. I retreated to my temporary workspace in the shadows, watching the lights of the main house flicker and knowing that the foundation of their greed was already starting to crumble beneath them. 3 weeks had passed since my bitter birthday night, and Preston stood in the center of the foyer with a smug grin as he announced that the restructuring project was officially complete. He tapped a stack of legal documents against his palm, declaring with chilling indifference that our entire family had exactly 2 days to vacate the premises. The reality of his betrayal finally hit the room like a physical wave when he revealed that Dad had forfeited all legal ownership of the Charleston estate. Because of that predatory addendum signed in a moment of desperation, the property had defaulted to Preston's shell company after the 7-day payment window closed. Dad slumped into a nearby armchair with his face turning a ghostly shade of gray, staring at the man he had once welcomed as a son-in-law. Mom gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard her knuckles turned white, her eyes darting between the legal papers and the cold, unyielding face of the man standing before her. Preston began checking his expensive watch, casually mentioning that his flight to Paris was scheduled for tomorrow evening to begin his new life. Sasha rushed to his side with a desperate smile, assuming she was still part of those glamorous plans, and began talking about which suitcases she should pack first. However, the air in the room shifted instantly when I stepped forward and held up a printed flight confirmation that Skylar had intercepted through her digital monitoring. The document clearly showed that Preston had booked 2 first-class tickets to Paris, but the second seat was reserved for a woman named Isabella, a notorious socialite from his gambling circles. Sasha's face twisted in confusion as she snatched the paper from my hand, her eyes scanning the name that definitely did not belong to her. She looked at Preston for a denial, but he only offered a thin, cynical smile that confirmed his intention to leave her behind in the wreckage of our home. During this chaotic confrontation, my phone buzzed with an urgent message from Julian Vance, who had finally completed the legal verification of our debt acquisition. He informed me that the senior debt I now held gave me the absolute right of first refusal and priority over any secondary contracts Preston had manufactured. This meant that legally the bank's original claim, which I now controlled, was superior to the fraudulent foreclosure Preston was currently trying to enforce. I kept this information locked behind a calm expression, watching as my family began to realize the true depth of the hole they had dug for themselves. Mom and Dad began to panic, their arrogant facades crumbling into a pathetic display of pleading as they begged Preston to give them more time to find a solution. They reminded him of all the times they had supported his business ideas, yet he only pushed them away with a look of pure disgust. "Preston, you said we would have a beautiful future together in Paris. So why are my parents being forced out of this house like common intruders?" Sasha wailed as tears began to ruin her expensive makeup. She reached out to touch his arm, but he flinched away, as if her very presence was an inconvenience to his carefully timed exit strategy. "The future I planned definitely exists, Sasha, but it belongs to me alone, and not to you or your father's mountain of useless debts," Preston replied with a short, sharp laugh. He told her that he had never intended to marry into a family that was essentially a sinking ship, and that she was merely a convenient distraction while he secured the land. The silence that followed his words was heavy with the weight of years of misplaced trust, and the sudden realization of total financial ruin. I didn't offer any words of comfort as I walked past them toward my workshop to gather the final set of restored books I had promised to protect. The sound of Mom's muffled sobs filled the hallway, mixing with the sharp tone of Preston's voice as he began calling his movers to schedule the final clearing of the house. I ignored the chaos and focused on packing my tools with a steady hand, knowing that the evening of judgment was finally within my reach. My family was currently experiencing the coldest form of rejection from the man they had chosen over me, and the irony was that they still had no idea I held the only key to their salvation. I moved my last crate toward the garage, glancing back at the main house one last time before the shadows of the garden swallowed me whole. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would reveal the true master of this estate, and I was more than ready to play my final hand. Exactly 1 month after that humiliating birthday night, I decided to end this elaborate drama just as Preston prepared to sign the final asset seizure order. He was sitting at Dad's mahogany desk with a victory smile, surrounded by moving boxes and the broken remains of our family's pride. I walked into the study with Julian Vance by my side, followed closely by 2 uniformed police officers who immediately moved to block the exits. Preston looked up with a confused laugh, asking if I had finally come to beg for my old books, or perhaps a small room in the garage. I didn't say a word as Julian stepped forward and placed a thick file of evidence directly on top of the seizure documents Preston was about to sign. The file contained undeniable proof of Preston's involvement in a massive insurance fraud scheme and the systematic theft of company funds over the last 3 years. Preston's face turned a sickly shade of white for a split second before he tried to counterattack by waving the predatory contract Dad had previously signed. He yelled that he was the legal owner of everything we possessed, and that no amount of petty accusations could change the recorded deeds of the property. Julian stepped forward again and calmly explained that the entire debt Preston relied on had been bought by an anonymous entity weeks ago. Because I was the true holder of that senior debt, Preston's secondary contracts were legally void and held no power over the estate or our assets. Sasha gasped in the background, her eyes darting between the police officers and the man she had planned to flee to Paris with just hours ago. I then revealed the final piece of the puzzle by showing everyone the flight records that proved Preston was planning to abandon Sasha at the airport for another woman. The complete collapse of my family's reality happened in total silence, as the weight of Preston's betrayal finally crushed their arrogant illusions. Sasha began to wail, realization dawning on her that the man she had defended over her own sister was nothing more than a common thief and a liar. Mom looked at me with a mixture of fear and sudden hope, perhaps expecting me to rush to her side and offer the comfort I had always provided in the past. Instead, I looked at both of them with eyes that felt no more pain, only a deep and hollow sense of emptiness that years of neglect had created. I didn't feel the joy of victory I had expected because watching the people who raised me realize their own worthlessness was a tragedy in itself. "Where did you even get the money to pull off a move like this, you pathetic little book restorer?" Preston roared while the officers moved in to place him under arrest for his financial crimes. He struggled against their grip, looking at me with a combination of pure hatred and a desperate need to understand how he had been outplayed. I simply turned my phone screen toward him, displaying the creditor account notification that listed me as the sole owner of the multi-million-dollar trust. I didn't need to show them the actual lottery ticket because the power I now held spoke much louder than any piece of paper could. "Your trash is sometimes another person's treasure, Preston, but you were always just trash in a very expensive suit," I said while watching the police lead him out of the house in handcuffs. As the sirens faded into the distance, I stood in the middle of the quiet foyer and watched Mom and Sasha huddle together in their shared misery. They began to apologize in broken voices, suddenly calling me their beloved Alana and claiming they had always known I was the strongest member of the family. I ignored their desperate pleas and walked toward the front door, knowing that I had finally saved the estate, but had lost the desire to live within its walls. I realized that my restoration work was finally finished, not on a book or a piece of furniture, but on my own sense of self-worth. I walked out into the cool evening air without looking back, leaving the ghosts of my past to deal with the wreckage of their own greed. 1 week after the Charleston police led Preston away in handcuffs, the garden estate that was once filled with loud arguments fell into a deadly silence. I walked through the empty hallways one last time, feeling the strange weight of the memories that had once defined my entire existence. My first action as the new legal owner was to pay off every single debt and mortgage that Dad had accumulated during his disastrous business dealings. I did not perform this final act of generosity out of a sense of lingering family affection or a desire for reconciliation. Instead, I settled every outstanding bill specifically to sever our emotional ties cleanly so that we would never owe each other anything ever again. I felt a profound sense of relief as I signed the final transfer papers to donate the entire estate to a national foundation for the preservation of ancient books. This house had become a monument to greed and betrayal, so I wanted it to serve a purpose that actually valued the history I had spent years protecting. Russell and Beverly were forced to move into a small, cramped apartment in a different part of the city while they lived in the shadow of their late-stage regret. Mom spent her days staring out the window at the busy street, realizing too late that she had traded her daughter's love for a criminal's empty promises. Dad sat in his small armchair surrounded by the few remaining items I allowed him to keep his pride completely broken by the reality of his own failures. Sasha was now facing the harsh consequences of her vanity, working long hours in a service job to pay off the personal credit cards she had maxed out for Preston. I watched them from a distance for a brief moment, but I did not feel the need to offer any additional help because their current struggle was the price of their choices. They had lost the luxury they worshipped, and in the process they had finally learned the true value of the person they had discarded. I decided to leave the memories of South Carolina behind and move to New York City to open a grand institute for book restoration and historical preservation. My new studio was located in a bright, modern building where the sunlight hit the workbenches perfectly throughout the entire afternoon. I spent my days surrounded by talented students and rare manuscripts, rebuilding my career from the very things that society had once considered abandoned or useless. It was a beautiful irony that my life had followed the same path as the damaged books I had spent so many years trying to save from the fire. I was no longer the invisible daughter hiding in the shadows of a workshop, but a respected professional who had built a fortune from her own passion. The lottery ticket had provided the initial spark, but my own resilience was the foundation upon which I built this new and better version of my life. The final image of my journey was not one of revenge, but of a quiet and powerful victory over the circumstances that had once tried to break me. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office, looking out at the vast Manhattan horizon as the city lights began to flicker on for the evening. I felt a sense of freedom that I had never known before, a pride that came from knowing I had survived the worst betrayals without losing my soul. The air in this new city was cold and fresh, carrying the scent of paper and ink that had always been my true home. I was finally standing on my own feet, a woman who had turned her ashes into a kingdom that no one could ever take away from her again. The sun dipped below the skyline, leaving me in a state of perfect peace as I prepared to start the next chapter of my story with a smile. Before we wrap up Alana's dramatic journey today, don't leave just yet, because what I'm about to share is the true core value we all need to reflect on. This story isn't just about a financial reversal. It is a profound lesson in the justice of self-respect. The host believes that the greatest mistake made by Beverly and Sasha wasn't their greed for money, but the fact that they severed the most sacred bond of all family. They looked down on Alana because she chose a quiet, humble profession, never realizing that it was precisely that stillness that forged her iron will to weather any storm. Another lesson clearly seen here is that money can buy luxury, but it cannot buy wisdom. Never let temporary glitz and glamour drive away the only person who truly has your back. When the darkness falls, silver-tongued deceivers like Preston will vanish, leaving only the quiet, steady souls like Alana with enough strength to shield the family. Life is full of unexpected turns, and Alana chose to cut ties completely to protect her own soul. If you were in her shoes, would you have the courage to walk away from a toxic family and start over from scratch? Or do you have a more compassionate solution? Leave a comment below so we can discuss it together. Thank you for listening until the very end. Don't forget to hit subscribe to support the channel. See you in the next story.